What if the oldest written records on Earth contain a chapter of human history that was deliberately cut from the version we were taught in school? What if the civilization that produced those records was so ancient and so organized that its existence breaks the entire timeline of human development as mainstream archaeology currently understands it? What if the texts that describe what happened in the beginning were not mythology at all, but a literal account of events that someone, at some point in history, decided the rest of the world should never fully understand? What if the story of our own origin was edited before it reached us? And what if the people who edited it left just enough behind that the shape of what was removed is still visible in the gaps? If this mystery is pulling you in, please like and subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an investigation. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We are reading every single one. The civilization in question is Sumer. The records in question are the oldest written documents in human history, and the beings described in those records are called the Anunnaki. What those records say about the Anunnaki, about the creation of the human species, about what happened before the Great Flood, and about who has been working to ensure that the full meaning of those records never reaches general knowledge, is the subject of this investigation. And the deeper you go into what those tablets actually say, the harder it becomes to accept that any of it is simply mythology. In the standard account of human history, civilization develops gradually. Hunter-gatherer communities slowly develop agriculture. Agricultural communities slowly develop permanent settlements. Permanent settlements slowly develop writing, mathematics, law, medicine, astronomy, and the other markers of what we call civilization. This progression takes thousands of years. It has a logical developmental sequence that makes intuitive sense. You cannot have writing before you have something you need to write about. You cannot have astronomy before you have communities stable enough to observe the sky consistently over generations. The rule of gradual development is so consistent across the archaeological record of so many cultures and so many parts of the world that it has become the foundational assumption of ancient history. The civilization that appeared in southern Mesopotamia, in the flat, fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, around 5000 to 3500 BC, does not follow this pattern. It does not have a visible developmental period. Writing appears in Sumer in a form that is already complex and systematic. Mathematics appears in Sumer with concepts that other civilizations would not develop independently for thousands of years. Astronomy appears in Sumer with a precision of observation that required generations of systematic record-keeping that should have left traces of its own gradual development. None of those traces are present. The knowledge is simply there, fully formed, at the beginning of the record. This is not a minor anomaly that can be explained by gaps in the archaeological data. It is the central problem of ancient history, acknowledged by mainstream scholars and never satisfactorily resolved. The Sumerian number system was base 60. This is the system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. Those numbers are not arbitrary. They are the product of a specific mathematical tradition. The choice of 60 as a base number is not obvious. It is not the number of fingers on two hands. It is not the number of days in a month or moons in a year. 60 was chosen because it has more divisors than any smaller number, making it exceptionally useful for the kinds of calculations required in astronomy and engineering. A number is said to have many divisors if it can be divided evenly by many smaller numbers without a remainder. 60 can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 20, and 30. No number smaller than 60 has as many divisors. The Sumerians knew this. They built their entire numerical system around it. And they did this, as far as the archaeological record shows, without a transitional period in which they worked with simpler systems and gradually moved toward 60. The Sumerian king list is a clay tablet document that records the names of kings who ruled in Sumer from the earliest times. It begins before the flood. The pre-flood section of the king list records 8 kings who ruled across 5 cities for a total of 432,000 years. The individual reigns listed range from 18,600 years to 43,200 years to 43,200 years. These numbers are not the result of scribal error or poetic exaggeration. They are consistent across multiple copies of the king list found at different sites. They appear to be deliberate. And they are not the only place in the ancient Sumerian record where timescales of this kind appear. The Babylonian historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, recorded a tradition that the period between the creation of civilization and the Great Flood was 432,000 years. The number appears in Hindu cosmological texts in different but related forms. The Icelandic prose Edda states that 432,000 warriors will fight in the final battle at the end of time. Whether this number represents a real astronomical period, a symbolic value, or something else entirely is a question that has not been resolved. The texts that describe the beings responsible for all of this, the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, state clearly that the Anunnaki came from somewhere else. They came to Earth. They established cities. They created human beings. They ruled over human beings for a specific period of time. And then something happened that changed the arrangement permanently. The texts describe this in concrete physical terms, not in the abstract language of metaphor or religious symbolism. They describe it as a sequence of events with causes and effects, and actors who had names and roles and conflicts with each other. This is what makes the Anunnaki tradition different from other ancient religious traditions in a way that mainstream scholarship has consistently struggled to account for. Comparative archaeology across other parts of the world shows what the developmental period of a complex civilization typically looks like. In China, the development of writing and complex social organization can be traced through several thousand years of progressively more complex material culture. From simple pottery traditions through early bronze working through the emergence of the first true script. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization that preceded the Maya shows similar progressive development across centuries of material change. In Egypt, the pre-dynastic period is well documented in the archaeological record and shows the gradual accumulation of the characteristics that would eventually produce the Old Kingdom. You can see the progression, you can point to the stages. The before and the after are both present in the evidence. In Sumer, the period before the emergence of full Sumerian civilization is called the Ubaidid period. The Ubaid people, who occupied the same geographic area from approximately 6500 to 3800 BC, produced pottery, simple agriculture, and small settlements. They did not produce writing. They did not produce the complex administrative systems of the Sumerian city-states. They did not produce the mathematical sophistication that appears in the earliest Sumerian records. The transition from Ubaidi to Sumerian is not a smooth developmental curve. It is a step change. Something happened. What it was is not recorded in the archaeological evidence of gradual material development, because the gradual material development did not occur. And the mainstream academic response to this observation, which is to note that the transition, while rapid by the standards of gradual development, still took several centuries, does not explain the base 60 mathematics or the astronomical precision or the institutional complexity that appears at the beginning of the Sumerian record with no visible precedent. The question of whether these texts are mythology or history is the question this investigation is about. And the answer to that question has implications that extend far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The story of how the Sumerian tablets were found and translated is itself a story of discovery, conflict, and selective attention that has shaped what the general public has been allowed to know about what the tablets contain. In 1839, a British diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard traveled to the region of northern Iraq, then part of the Ottoman Empire, and began excavating a large mound near the modern city of Mosul. The mound was the buried ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh, which the Bible described as the greatest city in the world at the time of its existence. What Layard found inside the ruins of Nineveh's royal palace was beyond anything he or anyone else had anticipated. The palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled from approximately 668 to 627 BC, contained a royal library. Not a library in the modern sense of scrolls or bound books. A library of clay tablets. Ashurbanipal had, over the course of his reign, assembled the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world by sending scribes across the Mesopotamian region to find and copy every significant text they could locate. The result was a collection estimated at between 25,000 and 30,000 individual clay tablets, inscribed in cuneiform script, covering every subject of knowledge in the ancient Mesopotamian tradition: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, history, ritual, and literature. The tablets were transported to the British Museum in London, where teams of scholars began the long process of cleaning, cataloguing, and attempting to decipher them. Cuneiform script had not been read for over 2,000 years. Deciphering it required the same kind of comparative linguistic work that had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The key was found in a trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun in modern Iran, commissioned by the Persian king Darius I in the 5th century BC. The Behistun inscription recorded the same royal proclamation in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Scholars who could already read Old Persian used it to decode the cuneiform, and by the 1860s, enough progress had been made that individual tablets could be read with reasonable confidence. In 1872, a scholar at the British Museum named George Smith was working through the Nineveh collection when he recognized something that stopped him cold. One of the tablets contained a story about a great flood, a man warned by a god, a large vessel, animals loaded aboard, the rest of humanity destroyed. The story was almost word for word the same as the flood narrative in the book of Genesis, except that this tablet, written in Akkadian cuneiform and discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, was significantly older than any version of the Genesis text that scholars had dated at the time. Smith's discovery sent a shock through the scholarly and religious establishment of Victorian England. The Bible's flood story was not original. It had a predecessor, and that predecessor came from a civilization that mainstream religious thought had considered pagan and irrelevant. George Smith became famous overnight. He died of dysentery in Syria in 1876 at the age of 36, still searching for more tablets that might explain what he had found. What Smith had discovered was a portion of what is now called the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest known work of literature. But the Epic of Gilgamesh was itself derived from older Sumerian sources, and the older Sumerian sources contained information that went far beyond a flood story. Beginning in 1888, a team from the University of Pennsylvania began excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, located in what is now central Iraq. Nippur was one of the oldest religious centers in the ancient world, a city dedicated to the god Enlil and considered the spiritual capital of Sumer. The Nippur excavations, which continued across multiple seasons into the early 20th century, uncovered approximately 50,000 additional cuneiform tablets, the largest single collection of Sumerian language texts ever found. Among the scholars who spent their careers working through the Nippur collection was an American academic named Samuel Noah Kramer. Kramer, who worked from the 1930s through the 1980s, is responsible for translating and publishing more original Sumerian literature than any other scholar in history. His books, particularly History Begins at Sumer, published in 1956, introduced the general public to the actual content of Sumerian texts for the first time. Kramer was a careful and methodical scholar who stayed firmly within mainstream academic interpretations, but the texts he translated and published, read with open eyes, contain material that the mainstream interpretation has never fully explained. What Kramer documented, without drawing the conclusions that the evidence might support, is a body of literature describing in specific institutional terms a period of human history governed by beings who are not human and who came to Earth from somewhere else. The first generation of cuneiform scholars came from a European academic tradition that was deeply shaped by biblical studies. The discovery of the flood narrative in the Gilgamesh epic was shocking precisely because it challenged biblical uniqueness. But the response to that shock, once the initial controversy settled, was to integrate the Mesopotamian texts into the biblical framework, rather than allowing the Mesopotamian texts to challenge the framework itself. The Gilgamesh flood was treated as a corrupted version of the true account in Genesis, rather than as a parallel account from a tradition that might be equally or more original. This framing shaped how the Anunnaki content of the tablets was subsequently handled. Material that supported the biblical narrative was emphasized. Material that contradicted or complicated the biblical narrative was categorized as mythology, treated as symbolic rather than literal, and typically received less scholarly attention than the material that fit the established framework. The 2003 looting of the Iraq Museum during the invasion resulted in the loss of thousands of artifacts, including cuneiform tablets whose content had never been published. Some of these tablets were later recovered through international law enforcement operations. Many were not. They entered the black market for antiquities, where they were sold to private collectors. The failure to protect the museum while simultaneously protecting the Ministry of Oil during the same period of lawlessness in Baghdad is a decision that remains unexplained by any official accounting of the events. Whatever was in the Iraq Museum's unexcavated, untranslated, and unpublished collection of cuneiform tablets is now partly dispersed and partly lost. Whether any of that material contained information relevant to the Anunnaki tradition and its history is impossible to determine. The possibility cannot be ruled out. In 1976, a Romanian-born author named Zakaria Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. Sitchin proposed an interpretation of the Sumerian texts that was radically different from the mainstream academic reading, where mainstream scholars read the Anunnaki as mythological gods. Sitchin argued that the texts described them literally as physical beings who had come to Earth from another planet, created human beings through genetic engineering, and ruled over humanity for thousands of years. The academic establishment rejected Sitchin's work almost entirely, citing specific errors in his translations and a methodology that selected supporting evidence while ignoring contradicting evidence. These are legitimate criticisms, but what the rejection of Sitchin often obscured was a more fundamental question. Even setting aside his specific interpretations, what do the Sumerian texts actually say when read as literally as they present themselves? The answer to that question is more disturbing than either side of the Sitchin debate typically acknowledges. The Sumerian and Babylonian texts that describe the Anunnaki and the early history of humanity are not a single document. They are a body of literature accumulated across centuries, found in multiple locations, and existing in multiple versions that show how the stories were modified and adapted as they passed from culture to culture. The most important of these texts for understanding the full scope of what was recorded and what may have been erased are the following. The Atrahasis epic is a Babylonian text dating to approximately 1700 BC in its oldest surviving form, though it is believed to derive from older Sumerian sources. It tells the complete story of the Anunnaki's relationship with humanity from beginning to end. In the opening of the text, the Anunnaki are described as gods who came to Earth and were set to work performing physical labor. The work was mining. They dug canals and moved Earth for thousands of years. Eventually, the working Anunnaki rebelled against the labor. Their leader, a figure named Enki, proposed a solution. He would create a being, a primitive worker, to take on the labor burden. This being would be made from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain Anunnaki. The mother goddess Ninmah would shape the creature, and from this process the first human being would be created. The text does not describe this as a symbolic or spiritual event, it describes it as a physical procedure. Materials are combined, a being is produced, that being is tested to ensure it can perform the required work. The process is repeated until a working version is achieved. The language is clinical and specific in a way that reads less like religious mythology and more like a technical record. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation epic, inscribed on 7 clay tablets and recited at the Babylonian New Year festival. It describes the creation of the world itself by the Anunnaki, or in its Babylonian form, by the god Marduk. The Enuma Elish is the text that most closely parallels the creation narrative in Genesis, and the parallels are detailed enough that scholars have debated for over a century whether Genesis borrowed from it or whether both derive from a common and older source. What is less often discussed in mainstream accounts of the Enuma Elish is the organizational structure it describes. The Anunnaki are arranged in a hierarchy. There are 300 Anunnaki of heaven and 300 Anunnaki of the earth, for a total of 600. They have specific roles, ranks, and domains of responsibility. The great Anunnaki are 7 in number. Below them are the Igigi, a separate category of lesser divine beings who perform the labor the great Anunnaki direct. This is not the organizational structure of a mythology about natural forces. It is the organizational structure of an administration. The conflict between Enki and Enlil that runs through multiple Sumerian texts is the most politically charged element of the entire Anunnaki tradition, and it is the element that was most consistently removed from later adaptations. Enlil was the ruler of the earth among the Anunnaki. His name in Sumerian means Lord of the Wind or Lord of the Air, and his domain was the surface world, the earth itself and all of humanity upon it. He was the highest authority in the Council of the Anunnaki for matters concerning the earth and its inhabitants. Enki was Enlil's brother. His domain was the Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth, and he was the god of wisdom, of craft, of magic, and of the knowledge that the Emi represented. Enki was the one who created humanity. He was the one who designed the procedure by which the first human beings were made. He was the administrator of the knowledge that made civilization possible. And he was, consistently across the tradition, the one who protected humanity from Enlil's worst decisions. The Atrahasis epic describes a sequence of events in which Enlil, troubled by the growth and noise of the human population, repeatedly attempts to reduce that population through disease, drought, and eventually the flood. In each case except the last, Enki intervenes. He warns the humans secretly. He teaches them how to survive the specific threat. He uses his knowledge and his authority over the deep water to counteract Enlil's measures. This is not the conflict between good and evil that characterizes most mythological oppositions between divine figures. It is a conflict between 2 members of the same administration with different philosophies about how to manage the population they are responsible for. Enlil views the human population as a resource that needs to be kept at manageable levels. Enki views it as something he created and feels responsible for. The flood is the final escalation of this ongoing policy conflict, and Enki's decision to warn Atrahasis is his final act of defiance against Enlil's position. The ME require specific attention because they are, within the Sumerian textual tradition, the most concrete evidence of what the Anunnaki were understood to have brought to humanity. The ME are described in Sumerian texts as a collection of specific items, each representing a particular aspect of civilization. They include the art of writing, the art of descent to the underworld and ascent from it, the musical instruments, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver, the ability to perform rituals, the art of the scribe, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the carpenter, the ability to travel on the road, the ability to make decisions, the administration of justice, and many others. The list runs to over 100 specific items. What is significant about the ME is that they are not described as ideas that humans developed over time. They are described as objects, as physical things that were held in a specific place, administered by a specific deity, and could be carried, stolen, or given. Civilization, in the Sumerian understanding, was not developed by humans, it was received. The descent of Inanna to the underworld contains within its narrative a description of the underworld's organizational structure that reads less like mythology and more like a description of a real administrative system with real personnel. In the text, Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, decides to visit the underworld, the Great Below, ruled by her sister Ereshigal. She passes through 7 gates on her way down, and at each gate she is required to remove one item of her divine regalia. By the time she reaches Ereshigal's throne room, she has been stripped of everything. The underworld is described with a specificity of institutional detail that is characteristic of the wider Anunnaki tradition. The underworld has 7 gates. Each gate has a gatekeeper with a specific name and a specific role. The underworld is governed by specific laws. The 7 judges of the underworld, called the Anunnaki, sit before Ereshigal and make decisions according to a defined process. Even the Queen of Heaven was subject to the system. This portrait of a cosmos governed by law and organizational structure, administered by a defined hierarchy of beings with specific roles and specific limitations on their authority, is not what conventional mythology looks like. It is the texture of an institution. The specific astronomical content of the Anunnaki tradition is also relevant. The Sumerian astronomical tradition attributed to the Anunnaki included period relations for the movements of the sun, moon, and planets accurate enough to produce eclipse predictions valid over centuries. The total pre-flood reign of 432,000 years in the king list is exactly 72 times 6,000. The number 72 is astronomically significant. It is the number of years required for the precession of the equinoxes to shift by 1 degree. The precession of the equinoxes is a slow wobble in the Earth's axial orientation that causes the position of the Sun at the equinoxes to shift gradually through the zodiac over a period of approximately 25,920 years. The number 25,920 years. The number 25,920 equals 72 times 360. These numerical relationships between the king list totals and the key numbers of precessional astronomy were identified by the researchers Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von der Schend in their 1969 work, Hamlet's Mill. If the precessional numbers in the king list are deliberate, they represent an encoding of astronomical knowledge in a narrative form, which would mean that the king list is not simply a record of ancient rulers with exaggerated reigns. It is a document that uses the narrative form of a list of rulers to preserve a body of astronomical data about very long time cycles. And if that is what it is, then the question of who had access to knowledge of precessional cycles in the period when the king list was composed is a question that does not have a comfortable conventional answer. 5 main interpretive frameworks have been applied to the Sumerian Anunnaki texts, and they produce conclusions that are so different from each other that they might as well be describing different source material. Understanding the full range of interpretation is necessary for understanding why the question of what these texts actually mean remains genuinely unresolved. The mainstream academic interpretation holds that the Anunnaki are gods in the conventional mythological sense. They are personifications of natural forces, of celestial bodies, of the powerful phenomena that ancient people could not otherwise explain. Enlil, the sky god, represents the power of wind and storm. Enki, the god of the deep water, represents the fertilizing power of rivers and irrigation. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, represents the contradictory powers of attraction and destruction. On this view, the Anunnaki narratives are sophisticated mythological explanations of the natural world, and the long reigns in the king list are either symbolic or represent a misreading of the calendar system in which the Sumerians counted. This interpretation is supported by substantial evidence. The Anunnaki are clearly associated with specific celestial bodies and natural phenomena in the texts. The difficulty with the mainstream interpretation is that it does not explain the specificity of the administrative detail in the texts. The Anunnaki have names, family relationships, bureaucratic ranks, specific domains of professional expertise, and personal conflicts that read more like political history than natural mythology. This level of concrete institutional detail is unusual in comparative mythology. The Sitchin interpretation takes the texts at their most literal face value and concludes that the Anunnaki were physical beings from another planet, specifically from a body he called Nibiru, who came to Earth seeking gold, found gold in the region of southern Africa, created human beings as labor through genetic modification of existing hominids, established a civilization in Mesopotamia, and eventually departed or withdrew from direct involvement with humanity following a series of catastrophic events, including the Great Flood and subsequent conflicts among cells. Sitchin's interpretation has been rejected by mainstream scholars on specific linguistic and scientific grounds. His translations of individual Sumerian words and passages contain errors that professional Sumerologists have documented in detail. His astronomical claims about Nibiru's orbital period are not supported by any observational evidence, and his methodology, selecting evidence that confirms his theory while dismissing evidence that contradicts it, is not consistent with rigorous historical scholarship. What the rejection of Sitchin does not settle is the deeper question his work pointed toward. What were the Anunnaki in the understanding of the people who wrote about them? The third major interpretive framework argues for an intermediate position. It accepts that the Sumerian texts contain genuine historical memory of an ancient and advanced civilization, while remaining agnostic about the specific nature of that civilization. On this view, the Anunnaki stories preserve, in mythologized form, a real tradition about a group of people or beings who established civilization in Mesopotamia, who possessed knowledge and capabilities that the later populations who encountered their legacy could only describe in supernatural terms, and who eventually disappeared from the historical record through processes we do not yet fully understand. This framework does not require extraterrestrial origin. It requires only that we take seriously the possibility that human history, particularly in the period before the flood referenced in the texts, contained developments that the current archaeological record does not reflect. The fourth framework is explicitly focused on the question of erasure. It argues that the specific pattern of how the Anunnaki tradition was modified, compressed, and eventually suppressed across successive Mesopotamian cultures is itself evidence of a deliberate editorial process. The original Sumerian texts, translated by scholars like Kramer, contain detailed and concrete descriptions of the Anunnaki and their relationship with humanity. The Akkadian adaptations of those texts, produced when the Akkadian Empire absorbed Sumer in the late 3rd millennium BC, consistently replaced Sumerian deity names with Akkadian equivalents and subtly shifted the emphasis away from the Anunnaki's direct physical involvement with humanity. The Babylonian adaptation shifted it further. By the time these stories reached the Hebrew tradition that produced Genesis, the Anunnaki had been entirely removed and the narrative had been condensed to a version that preserved the broad outlines of the original while stripping out the specific detail about who the actors were and what they actually did. Whether this progressive simplification was deliberate censorship or the natural result of cultural transmission across centuries and language boundaries is the central interpretive question. Across the Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Hebrew transmission of the Anunnaki tradition, the following elements were consistently preserved: the flood, the preserved individual, the garden and its prohibition, the creation of humanity from earth and divine substance. The following elements were consistently removed: the names and individual identities of the Anunnaki, the specific political conflict between Enki and Enlil that preceded the flood, the specific reason for the flood as a deliberate decision to reduce human population, the existence of a council of Anunnaki who voted on major decisions affecting humanity, the description of the creation of humanity as a labor-saving measure, the specific ME and their institutional management, and the specific timescales of the pre-flood period. This is not a random pattern of loss through cultural transmission. The elements that were removed from the Anunnaki tradition are the elements that describe who the Anunnaki were as specific individuals, what they wanted, and what the real nature of their relationship with humanity was. What survived is the bare bones of the narrative without the flesh that would allow it to be understood on its own terms. What the deeper structure of the tradition reveals goes beyond everything described above, and what remains missing from the surviving texts may be the most important part of all. The deeper you go into the specific content of the Sumerian texts, the more you encounter material that the standard interpretive frameworks struggle to accommodate. Several specific categories of evidence in the tablets have never been satisfactorily explained within the mainstream mythological reading, and they become more rather than less puzzling the more carefully they are examined. The first concerns the physical geography described in the texts. The Sumerian texts describe specific locations with a specificity that is unusual for mythology. The 5 pre-flood cities are named and located. The rivers are named. The distances between locations are given. The resources found in specific regions are identified. When archaeologists have looked for the sites named in the texts, they have found them. The city of Eridu, described in the texts as the oldest city and the original seat of Anunnaki governance, was identified and excavated at a site now called Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq. The excavations confirmed that Eridu, known to archaeologists as Eridu, is indeed the oldest urban settlement yet identified in Mesopotamia. Its earliest occupation layers date to approximately 5400 BC. The city was real, and its location matches the geographic description in the texts with precision. This does not prove that the Anunnaki were real, but it does confirm that whoever wrote these texts had access to accurate geographic information about real places, which is a different kind of claim than purely symbolic mythology requires. Excavations at Eridu in the 1940s and 1950s by Iraqi archaeologists identified 18 distinct levels of occupation at the site, extending from the most recent Sumerian period down to the earliest Ubaid levels dating to approximately 5400 BC. At the lowest level, the archaeologists found the remains of a small mud-brick structure that they interpreted as a temple, based on the presence of an offering table and other features consistent with later Mesopotamian religious architecture. This tiny structure at the base of the Eridu sequence has been called the world's oldest temple. Above it, through each successive level of occupation, the structure was rebuilt progressively larger, eventually becoming the massive ziggurat that dominated the later city. The continuous construction sequence at Eridu, from a small room-sized structure in the Ubaid period to a full-scale urban temple complex in the Sumerian period, represents one of the clearest examples of architectural development in the ancient world. And the tradition that identified Eridu as the oldest city and the original site of Anunnaki governance was maintained continuously from the earliest known occupation through the entire history of Sumerian civilization. The site was never abandoned and rebuilt as a new place with a new identity. It was recognized as the same place, with the same religious significance, across more than 2,000 years of continuous occupation. The second category of deeper mystery concerns the specific knowledge the texts attribute to the Anunnaki. The ME include items of knowledge that the Sumerians clearly possessed: writing, mathematics, metallurgy, agriculture, law, and medicine. When historians examine the actual development of this knowledge, they find the same anomaly that appears in the development of Sumerian civilization as a whole. It appears without a clear developmental period. Sumerian mathematics includes concepts such as the use of place value notation and the manipulation of very large numbers that other mathematical traditions did not develop independently until thousands of years later. Sumerian astronomy tracked the movements of the planets with a precision that required either a very long tradition of systematic observation preceding the historical record or a body of astronomical knowledge that came from somewhere else. Sumerian medicine, as recorded in the tablets, includes treatments and diagnostic procedures that modern researchers have identified as sophisticated enough to have genuine therapeutic value. None of this is impossible to explain within a conventional account of human intellectual development. What makes it unusual is the combination of its sudden appearance and its high level of starting sophistication. The third category concerns what happened to the Anunnaki tradition itself. The original Sumerian text described the Anunnaki as a physical, organized, administratively complex presence in human civilization. Subsequent cultures that inherited the Mesopotamian textual tradition progressively reduced the Anunnaki from specific named individuals with roles and histories to generic divine forces, to brief references in text primarily about other things. By the time of the Assyrian period, The word Anunnaki in official texts had been largely reduced to a collective term for a category of underworld deities with no specific identities or histories. The rich tradition of the original Sumerian texts had been compressed almost to a point. What is notable about the Anunnaki specifically is the direction of the simplification. The older the text, the more concrete and specific the Anunnaki are. The newer the text, the more abstract and generic they become. This is the opposite of the usual pattern in the development of mythology, where later elaborations typically add detail rather than removing it. The Anunnaki tradition runs backward. It becomes less specific over time, not more. Something was being taken out. The fourth category concerns the question of the flood itself. The Sumerian texts describe a great flood as a real historical event that ended the pre-flood period and permanently changed the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity. Geological evidence supports the occurrence of major flood events in the ancient Near East. The geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman published research in the late 1990s proposing that the Black Sea was once a much smaller freshwater lake that was catastrophically flooded by the Mediterranean around 5600 BC when rising sea levels breached the Bosphorus. The scale of this event, which would have inundated thousands of square kilometers of previously inhabited land in a relatively short period, could plausibly have generated a cultural memory of catastrophic flooding that persisted for millennia. This is not proof that the Sumerian flood narrative describes this specific event, but it establishes that real flood events of sufficient scale to generate lasting cultural memory did occur in the ancient Near East within the relevant time period. What the Sumerian flood texts add to this picture is a specific claim about why the flood happened. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood was not a natural event, it was a decision. The great god Enlil, frustrated by the noise and population growth of humanity, convened the Council of the Anunnaki and proposed a flood as a solution. The other Anunnaki agreed. Enki, who disagreed with the decision but was bound by the council's resolution, found a way to warn a specific human, Atrahasis, without technically violating the agreement by speaking to the reed walls of his house rather than directly to the man. The flood was planned. It was implemented deliberately, and one human family was preserved through advance warning from a specific Anunnaki who was acting against the general consensus of the council. This account of a deliberate decision to destroy most of humanity, made by the Anunnaki in council, preserved in the oldest written record of any flood narrative, is one of the most difficult passages in the Sumerian texts to explain within a purely mythological framework. It is a political narrative about a specific decision made by specific actors with specific motivations and a specific exception made for a specific individual for specific reasons. The region of ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, is one of the least excavated areas of significant archaeological potential in the world. Decades of war, political instability, and the destruction of cultural sites have made systematic archaeology in the region extraordinarily difficult. What has been found largely through the excavation of individual prominent sites. The vast majority of the landscape, including many sites identified through satellite survey as archaeologically significant, has never been touched. Whether additional physical evidence of the Anunnaki tradition's claims exists somewhere in that landscape is neither provable nor disprovable with the current state of excavation. The possibility that further tablets or further physical evidence of the tradition remain in the ground of ancient Iraq is one that only continued excavation can test. And continued excavation for most of the past several decades has not been possible. The question of why any civilization would erase its own origin story is not as simple as it first appears. The instinct toward erasure is actually well documented in the historical record, and understanding why it happens in other contexts helps explain why it might have happened to the Anunnaki tradition. The most common reason for the deliberate modification of origin narratives is political. Every ruling authority in history has had a relationship with the story of how things came to be the way they are, because that story is the foundation of whatever legitimacy the ruling authority claims. If the origin story says that the gods created civilization and appointed specific people to govern it, then the people currently governing it have a strong interest in that story remaining the authoritative version. If a different origin story would imply that the current governing arrangement is illegitimate, or that the authority claimed by the rulers actually belongs to someone else, or that the rules the rulers enforce are not divinely sanctioned, but were made by beings who no longer have any involvement in human affairs, then that different story represents a threat. The political incentive to modify origin narratives is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest and most consistent patterns in the relationship between power and knowledge. The Anunnaki tradition, read at face value, is a profoundly destabilizing political narrative. It says that civilization was established by beings who are not gods in the conventional religious sense, but are physical actors who came from somewhere, did specific things for specific reasons, made decisions that affected humanity based on their own interests rather than humanity's well-being, and eventually left or withdrew. If this account is credibly understood as potentially true by a large population, it undermines every subsequent claim by every subsequent authority to rule by divine right. The gods who sanction the king's authority in Babylonian or Assyrian royal ideology are not the same beings as the Anunnaki of the early Sumerian texts. They are abstractions, cosmic forces, entities whose authority cannot be questioned because their nature cannot be examined. The Anunnaki of the early Sumerian texts are specific, finite, and in conflict with each other. That is not a useful foundation for a theology of divine kingship. The Akkadian Empire that absorbed Sumer in the 23rd century BC was the first empire in human history. It was built through military conquest and maintained through a combination of administrative control and ideological authority. The Akkadian rulers adopted and adapted the Sumerian religious tradition because religious legitimacy was essential to administrative control. But they adapted it in specific ways. The Sumerian Anunnaki tradition, with its picture of specific physical beings making specific political decisions that were sometimes contrary to human interests, was not ideologically convenient for a royal theology that needed the divine order to be eternal, unchanging, and fully supportive of the current ruling dynasty. The systematic replacement of Sumerian divine names with Akkadian equivalents, and the systematic abstraction of the Anunnaki from concrete actors to cosmic forces, served a clear political function. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of a process that historians of religion have documented and analyzed in many other cultural contexts. What makes the Anunnaki case unusual is not that it happened, but the scale and completeness of what was removed. The deeper philosophical question is what we lose when we decide that ancient texts are only mythology. The answer is not simply the specific content of the text themselves. We lose the possibility of asking the questions that the texts might be able to help us answer. If the Sumerian account of the Anunnaki is treated as mythology by definition, then the questions it raises: where did the sudden sophistication of Sumerian civilization come from? What is the meaning of the consistent ancient tradition of catastrophic flooding? What is the significance of the astronomical numbers embedded in the king list? Why did the detailed Anunnaki tradition progressively disappear from the cultures that inherited it? Simply do not get asked within the framework of serious scholarship. They get answered in advance by the assumption that the texts are symbolic, and the answers they might contain are never seriously pursued. There is a specific pattern in how the Anunnaki tradition declines across the centuries that is worth naming clearly. In the oldest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are administrators. They hold meetings. They vote. They disagree with each other. They make decisions that have consequences they did not fully anticipate. They are capable of being wrong. In the Akkadian texts, they are cosmic forces given human form but no longer institutional actors. In the Babylonian texts, they are background figures in a drama centered on Marduk. In the Hebrew tradition, they are absent altogether, replaced by a single omnipotent deity whose decisions are not subject to council or vote. The progression is not toward greater complexity or greater specificity, it is toward greater abstraction and greater centralization of divine authority. At each step, the Anunnaki become less specific, less institutional, and less capable of being understood as something other than mythology. The erasure is not a single event. It is a process, and the process was remarkably consistent across multiple independent transmission chains over a period of several thousand years. The Antikythera mechanism, which this channel investigated in the previous episode, demonstrated what happens when we take at face value something that our assumptions about ancient capability had led us to dismiss. The mechanism was in plain sight for a year before a researcher noticed it was a gear system. The Sumerian tablets have been in scholarly hands for over a century and a half. The question of whether they contain historical information that has been misclassified as mythology because of assumptions about what ancient people could have known and done is a question that the mechanism's existence makes harder to dismiss than it was before. We were wrong about the Antikythera mechanism. The question of whether we are wrong about the Anunnaki is one that the tablets themselves, read without the assumption that they must be mythology, continue to raise. The cuneiform tablets that contain the Anunnaki tradition are held in museums and university collections across the world. The British Museum in London has the largest collection, followed by the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Many of these tablets have been translated and published, many have not. The project of fully translating and publishing the known cuneiform corpus is a multi-generational scholarly undertaking that has been underway for over a century and is not yet complete, and that is only what has been found. The region of ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, is one of the least excavated areas of significant archaeological potential in the world. Decades of war, political instability, and the destruction of cultural sites have made systematic archaeology in the region extraordinarily difficult. The looting of the Iraq Museum during the 2003 invasion of Iraq resulted in the loss of thousands of artifacts, including cuneiform tablets whose content will never be known. Ongoing looting of unprotected archaeological sites across Iraq has destroyed context that can never be recovered. What has been found, translated, and published represents a fraction of what the ancient Mesopotamian civilization produced. And that fraction is already telling a story that the mainstream account of human history has not fully reckoned with. Could it be that the tablets that contain the most specific and the most significant portions of the Anunnaki tradition are among those that have not yet been found? Is it possible that somewhere in the unexcavated ruins of Nippur, or Ur, or Eridu, or Aridu, or Lagash, or in the dozens of significant sites that archaeologists have identified but never fully excavated, there are tablets that contain the chapter of the story that has been missing since the Akkadian Empire decided it was inconvenient? The possibility cannot be dismissed. The region has yielded major textual discoveries within the lifetimes of living scholars. It will yield more. What those discoveries will contain is unknown, but the pattern of what has already been found is consistent enough to suggest that what has not yet been found will push in the same direction toward a picture of the ancient world that is older, more sophisticated, and more specifically connected to the Anunnaki tradition than the standard account of ancient history currently acknowledges. The beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki are described in the oldest written records on Earth as the founders of civilization, the creators of the human species, and the rulers of the world in an age before the flood. Whether they were gods in the mythological sense, physical beings from somewhere else, memories of an advanced human civilization preserved in symbolic form, or something else entirely that none of the current interpretive frameworks has correctly identified, is a question that the available evidence cannot yet fully answer. What the available evidence can answer is the simpler and in some ways more troubling question of what happened to the tradition that described them. The tradition was modified, it was compressed. The specific detail that made the Anunnaki concrete and institutional was progressively removed as the stories passed from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Hebrew traditions. What arrived at the end of that chain of transmission was a story in which the specific actors, their specific conflicts, their specific decisions, and their specific relationship with the human beings they had created were almost entirely gone. The flood survived. The preserved man survived. The garden survived. But the beings who planned the flood, who argued about whether to warn the man who planted the garden and set the rules for its occupation, had been abstracted beyond recognition. Someone edited the story. The question is whether they edited it to protect a political arrangement that the original story would have threatened, or whether the editing was simply the natural result of cultural transmission across languages and centuries, and the loss was not deliberate but inevitable. There is a third possibility, that the editing was done by people who had read the original and understood it clearly, and who decided that the general population was not ready for what it contained. This is a more uncomfortable possibility than either of the others. It implies not just political motivation, but a specific judgment about what ordinary people should and should not know about their own origins. And it implies a decision made by someone with access to the original tradition and the authority to control its transmission, that the chapter describing the Anunnaki in full should not survive in its complete form. The oldest written records on Earth say that civilization did not develop gradually from within human communities. They say it was brought. They name the beings who brought it. They describe what those beings did and why they did it and how they eventually stopped doing it. And then, over the course of several thousand years of cultural transmission, every specific detail of that description was systematically removed from the version of the story that reached the present. The tablets that remain describe the edges of something. They describe the flood. They describe the preserved man. They describe the garden. They describe the creation of the first human from clay and divine substance. They name the Anunnaki in passing, as background actors in a drama whose center has been removed. What was at the center is the forbidden chapter. The Anunnaki are not in the history books we were taught in school. They are in the history books that the people who wrote our history books decided not to include. The clay tablets that contain their story are older than the Bible, older than the Quran, older than any religious text currently practiced in the world. They predate every authority that has since claimed the right to determine what counts as history and what counts as myth. And they say, plainly and specifically and repeatedly, that the story of where humanity came from and who was involved in making us what we are is not the story that was passed down. The forbidden chapter exists. Pieces of it are sitting in museum drawers right now, partially translated, waiting for a scholar who asks the right question. Other pieces may still be in the ground. And whatever was at the center of what was erased, whatever specific information made the tradition too dangerous to transmit intact, is the thing that this investigation cannot reach. Not because it does not exist, but because the people who decided it should not survive were very thorough, and very early. The question of what caused the Ubaid to Sumerian step change has occupied archaeologists for decades without producing a satisfactory conventional answer. Several hypotheses have been proposed. One suggests that a population of more advanced people migrated into the region from elsewhere, bringing their knowledge with them. The archaeological record does show evidence of population movement in the relevant period, but it does not show evidence of a migration large enough or from a sophisticated enough source to account for the scale of the transformation. Another hypothesis suggests that a small group of individuals with exceptional intellectual capability produced the innovations in a short period of time. This is the genius hypothesis, and it is difficult to evaluate because it is not falsifiable. If one person could invent writing, and another could formalize mathematics, and another could codify law, all within a short period in the same region, the result would look exactly like what we see in the Sumerian record. But the probability of this convergence is low, and the hypothesis does not explain why the subsequent development of these systems within Sumer shows the characteristics of an established tradition rather than ongoing innovation. The Sumerian language itself is a mystery that compounds the problem. It is a language isolate, meaning it has no known relationship to any other language family. It is not related to the Semitic languages of the surrounding region, including Akkadian, which eventually replaced it. It is not related to any language of the Indo-European family. It is not related to Egyptian or to any other ancient language whose affiliations have been established. Wherever the Sumerians came from, and whatever the origin of their language, it arrived in Mesopotamia without leaving a traceable trail of related languages in any adjacent region. This is unusual. Most language families have identifiable relatives. The absence of any identifiable relative of Sumerian is another data point that the standard account of how Sumerian civilization developed does not satisfactorily explain. The ancient Sumerian texts themselves acknowledge the strangeness of their own origin by placing it outside the normal course of human events. The Sumerians did not claim to have developed their civilization through their own ingenuity. They claimed to have received it. The the bundle of civilizational technologies attributed to the Anunnaki, were not invented by Sumerians. They were given to Sumerians by beings who had them first. This is an unusual kind of claim for a civilization to make about itself. Most ancient civilizations, when they construct narratives about their own origins, attribute their achievements to their own great ancestors or to the favor of the gods expressed through natural processes. The Sumerians attributed their civilization not to natural processes or to their own ancestors, but to a specific transfer of knowledge from specific beings who are not human. Whatever this claim means, the fact that it is consistent across the tradition and is encoded in their oldest and most fundamental texts suggests it was not an afterthought. It was the foundation of how the Sumerians understood themselves. The Sumerian king list is worth returning to in more detail because its structure contains information that goes beyond the simple claim of impossibly long reigns. The 5 cities named as the pre-flood seats of governance, Eridug, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, are not randomly chosen. Each is associated with a specific Anunnaki deity. Each is associated with a specific function in the overall system that the Anunnaki administered. Eridug was the city of Enki, associated with wisdom and the deep water. Bad Tabira was associated with metalworking, its name meaning fortified copper smelter in Sumerian. Larak's function is less clearly identified in the surviving texts. Sippar was associated with the sun god Shamash and with astronomical observation. Shuruppak was the city where Atrahasis, the Sumerian flood survivor, lived. This system of 5 functionally differentiated cities, each assigned to a specific divine administrator, is not a mythological conceit. It is an administrative structure. The Sumerian king list is not just a list of rulers with impossible ages. It is a record of an administrative system whose structure it describes in compressed form. The connection between the Anunnaki tradition and the concept of divine kingship in the ancient Near East is direct and explicit in the texts. After the flood, according to the king list and to multiple other Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki transferred the management of human civilization to human kings rather than continuing to govern directly. The mechanism of this transfer is described in texts about a concept called the Nam-Lugal, which can be translated as kingship or the office of king. The Nam-Lugal was not invented by humans. It was lowered from heaven, like the Mn, by the Anunnaki. A specific human was selected to hold it. That human and his successors administered the cities on behalf of the Anunnaki, who continued to exist and to have opinions about human affairs, but who no longer governed directly. This model of kingship as a divine franchise, granted by specific beings to specific humans for specific purposes and administrable according to specific rules, is distinct from every subsequent model of divine kingship in the ancient world. In later Mesopotamian traditions, and in the traditions that derive from them, kings were chosen by the gods to be their representatives. In the original Sumerian tradition, kings held an administrative office that had been created by the Anunnaki and delegated to humans when the Anunnaki withdrew from direct governance. The distinction is subtle but significant. In one model, the gods are permanent cosmic forces who periodically select human agents. In the other, the Anunnaki are specific actors who created a specific institutional arrangement and then stepped back from it. The first model is consistent with mythology. The second model is consistent with history. Several specific passages in the Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki in terms that raise questions about their nature that the mythological interpretation cannot cleanly resolve. In the text known as Enki and the World Order, Enki travels around the earth assigning specific divine overseers to specific regions and specific resources. He assigns a god to oversee the marshes and their fish, a god to oversee the rivers and their irrigation, a god to oversee the plowing of fields, a god to oversee the baking of bread, a god to oversee the weaving of cloth. The list goes on for hundreds of lines. Each assignment is specific. Each overseer has a specific domain and a specific function, and each of these domains corresponds to an actual sector of Sumerian economic life. The divine oversight that Enki is assigning in this text corresponds precisely to the administrative structure of the actual Sumerian city-state economy, in which temple institutions manage specific sectors of economic production and maintain the records of that production in the cuneiform tablets that archaeologists have recovered. Whether the divine oversight in the text is a mythological reflection of the real administrative structure, or whether the real administrative structure is a human replication of a structure originally established by the Anunnaki, is a question that the texts themselves do not settle. Both readings are possible. The specific correspondence between the divine assignments and the actual economic sectors is not. There is a specific category of content in the Sumerian tablets that researchers have consistently found difficult to classify within the standard mythological framework: the technical descriptions. Across multiple Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described performing activities that are described in language that is technical rather than poetic. The construction of Eridug is described in terms that include specific measurements, specific materials, and specific procedures. The creation of irrigation systems is described in terms that correspond to actual hydraulic engineering. The extraction of specific metals is described in terms that correspond to actual metallurgical processes. These technical descriptions are embedded within texts that also contain clearly mythological elements, which has led some scholars to treat the entire text as mythology, and others to argue that the technical content represents a genuine record of knowledge that was preserved in mythological form because that was the form available for preserving important information across long periods of cultural transmission. The pre-flood city of Shuruppak deserves specific mention because it is the best archaeologically documented of the 5 pre-flood cities. Shuruppak, identified with the modern site of Tel Farah in southern Iraq, was excavated by multiple teams in the early 20th century. The excavations revealed a settlement dating to approximately 2900 to 2350 BC at its main occupation levels, with deeper levels suggesting earlier occupation. But what the Shuruppak excavations also revealed was evidence of a significant flood deposit at a specific layer of the site, a layer of water-laid sediment that separated the earlier from the later occupation. This flood layer at Shuruppak, identified by the excavators, corresponds in its approximate dating to similar flood deposits identified at the sites of Ur and Kish, and collectively, these deposits have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of a real regional flood event in the ancient Near East that may be connected to the flood traditions of the Sumerian texts. Whether this real regional flood is the same event described in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic is contested, but the existence of a real flood event at the real site of Shuruppak, at approximately the time period that the tradition associates with the flood, is not. It is a physical fact in the ground. The Sumerian tradition names Shuruppak as the city where Atrahasis lived when the flood came. The archaeology of that site shows evidence of a real flood. This is the kind of correspondence that the purely mythological interpretation of the Sumerian texts has difficulty explaining. The Akkadian concept of the Tablet of Destinies, derived from the Sumerian concept of the Me, appears in multiple texts as a specific physical object of extraordinary importance. In the myth of Zu, a divine bird named Zu steals the Tablet of Destinies from the god Enlil, temporarily disrupting the entire divine order. In the Enuma Elish, the Tablet of Destinies is a key prize in the conflict between the gods, and its possession by Marduk at the end of the conflict confirms his supremacy over all the other gods. The Tablet of Destinies is not described as a metaphor or an abstraction. It is described as a physical object that can be held, stolen, and transferred. Its possession confers specific powers. Its absence causes specific disruptions, and its content appears to be a record of the fates and functions of all beings within the cosmic order, a document that defines what everything is and what it does and what authority governs it. If this object is taken literally, it is a physical record of the operating rules of the system the Anunnaki established. If such a document ever existed in physical form, its current location and content would represent the most significant discovery in the history of ancient studies. Additional depth. Section 7. Supplement. There is a useful comparison available in the history of modern information management. When a government or institution wants to remove information from the accessible record without destroying it entirely, the standard procedure is to classify it, to move it to a controlled environment where access is restricted to authorized individuals, while maintaining the information itself for potential future use. The physical material is preserved, the access is denied. What remains in the public record is typically a reference to the classified material, enough to confirm that something exists, but not enough to reconstruct what it contains. When researchers look at the trajectory of the Anunnaki tradition from its Sumerian origins through its successive modifications, what they find looks structurally similar to a declassification process run in reverse. The early Sumerian tradition was the fully accessible version of the record. As it passed through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Hebrew transmission, the specific operational content was progressively removed while the broad outlines were retained. What the later traditions preserved was enough to confirm that something had happened, that there had been a flood, that there had been a garden, that there had been a creation of humanity, but not enough to reconstruct the specific identity and activities of the actors involved. This is not what organic cultural transmission typically produces. It is what deliberate information management typically produces. The persistence of the Anunnaki concept across cultures that had every reason to replace it is one of the most puzzling features of the tradition. After the Akkadian conquest of Sumer, the Akkadian rulers imposed their own language, their own administrative systems, and their own royal ideology on the conquered population. They replaced Sumerian gods with Akkadian equivalents across the official religious tradition, and yet the word Anunnaki survived. It was not replaced by an Akkadian equivalent. It was retained as a loanword in Akkadian, applied to a category of beings whose specific identity had been removed. The same pattern holds in Babylonian, where the word Anunnaki continues to appear in texts that have stripped out almost everything else from the original Sumerian tradition. A concept whose content has been emptied but whose name has been retained is a concept that someone considered important enough to keep as a category, even after the specific information associated with it had been removed. The category Anunnaki remained. What it referred to was reclassified. There is something specific about the way the Sumerian texts end that deserves attention as a closing observation. The texts that describe the transition from Anunnaki governance to human kingship do not describe the Anunnaki leaving in any simple or definitive way. They describe a withdrawal, a stepping back, a transfer of specific responsibilities to specific human institutions. The Anunnaki remain present in the world of the texts. They attend festivals. They receive offerings. They respond to prayers. They continue to have opinions about specific human decisions and occasionally express those opinions through oracles and omens. What ends is not their existence but their direct administrative involvement. The arrangement that replaces direct governance is one in which the Anunnaki are present as an audience and as a background authority, but in which the day-to-day management of civilization has been delegated to human institutions operating according to the rules the Anunnaki establish. This model of powerful beings who established a system and then withdrew from its direct management while remaining present in a more diffuse and less operationally specific way is the model that underlies every subsequent religious tradition in the ancient Near East. The gods of later Mesopotamian religion, of the Hebrew tradition, of the broader ancient Mediterranean world, all operate in this way. They are present, they care about human affairs, they occasionally intervene, but they do not administer, they do not hold meetings. They do not vote on policy decisions about the human population. The transition from the Anunnaki of the early Sumerian texts, who do all of these things, to the gods of later tradition, who do none of them, is not simply a change in religious belief. It is a change in the model of what the beings responsible for human civilization actually are and how they actually operate. The early Sumerian model is institutional, the later model is cosmic, and the transition between them, the specific process by which the institutional model was replaced by the cosmic model, is the forbidden chapter. What this investigation can say, based on the available evidence, is that the oldest written records on Earth describe a world that the standard account of ancient history does not accommodate. They describe a world in which civilization was established by specific beings who were not human, governed according to specific rules that were encoded in a physical collection of documents called the ME, transferred to human administration through a specific institutional process, and then progressively obscured in the written tradition that preserved the story. The obscuring was consistent, it was thorough, and it was specifically targeted at the elements of the tradition that would allow a reader to understand the Anunnaki as institutional actors rather than cosmic symbols. What remains is the outline, and the outline is enough to see the shape of what was removed. Not enough to reconstruct it fully. Not enough to answer the questions it would have answered, but enough to know that those questions exist and that they were once answerable by someone who had access to information that has since been taken out of the record. The tablets that contain the Anunnaki tradition are the oldest texts in human history. They were written by people who understood themselves to be recording real events, real beings, and real relationships. Whether they were right about what they were recording is a question that the current state of knowledge cannot definitively answer. But the question itself, whether the oldest written records in human history are describing something real or something symbolic, is the most important unanswered question in the study of ancient civilization. And it is a question that the mainstream academic tradition has, for reasons that are understandable given its institutional history, largely decided in advance rather than genuinely investigating. The forbidden chapter is not necessarily hidden in a specific undiscovered tablet or a specific unexcavated site. It may be hidden in plain sight in the texts that have already been found and translated, waiting for a reading that does not begin by assuming the conclusion. The ground of ancient Mesopotamia holds more than we have found. The collections of the world's museums hold more than we have read, and the tradition of the Anunnaki, whatever it ultimately means, is more than the mythology category has been able to contain. The clay tablets that carry it are older than every institution that has since claimed the authority to define what they mean, and they are still speaking to anyone willing to read them without deciding in advance that they cannot possibly be saying what they appear to say. That is the invitation the forbidden chapter extends. And it is an invitation that the oldest civilization in the world has been extending, in clay, for more than 5,000 years. There is a final observation worth making about the timing of the tradition's erasure. The most significant compression of the Anunnaki tradition occurred during a specific historical window, roughly from the 23rd to the 6th centuries BC, the period that saw the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, the rise and fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur, the Old Babylonian period, the Kassite period, the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the Persian conquest. This is the period during which every major ancient Near Eastern power rose to dominance over the Mesopotamian heartland, each bringing its own ideology and its own interest in defining the relationship between divine authority and human political power. Each of these powers had every reason to modify the tradition they inherited in ways that served their current political arrangements. And each of them did. The tradition did not lose its specific content by accident over a long period of gradual cultural drift. It lost it rapidly and consistently during a period of intense political competition over the legitimacy of divine governance. The specific content that was removed was the content most directly relevant to that competition, who the original governors were, what they were, and what kind of authority they actually held over human civilization. That content was politically dangerous precisely because it was specific and institutional rather than abstract and cosmic. And it was removed because the powers that needed a different origin story had both the motivation and the means to ensure that the version of the tradition that survived their rule was the version that served their interests. What this means for how we should read the surviving tradition is not that we should reject it as corrupted and therefore useless. It means we should read it as a document that has been through a specific editorial process and ask what that process tells us about what was originally there. Every cut leaves a shape, every removal creates a gap, and the gaps in the Anunnaki tradition. The places where the text becomes vague when it should be specific, where named actors are replaced by generic divine categories, where institutional processes are replaced by abstract cosmic events, are as informative as the text that remains. They tell us where the content was. They tell us what kind of content it was. And they tell us that someone, at some point in history, understood exactly what they were removing and removed it deliberately. The forbidden chapter is defined by its absence. And its absence, visible in the gaps and compressions and abstractions of every text that was supposed to replace it, is the most specific thing that remains.